The sky over Berlin hums, the air smells of coal and engine oil, and every minute tips toward hunger or hope. At night, the deep drone of C-47s and C-54s threads a necklace of light, descending, unloading, taking off, returning. Under the floodlights of Tempelhof, men in gray coats heave sacks, crates, and cans, while children count how often the propellers turn. A pilot folds a small chocolate bar into a handkerchief, ties two tiny parachutes with string, and smiles as he rolls into the dark. How could a blockaded city survive the summer of 1948, with no trains and no trucks, only the sky above? The answer begins on 24th June, 1948, when the western sectors of Berlin are cut off from power, rails, and roads, leaving 2 million people with food for weeks, not months. 3 narrow air corridors, fixed in Allied agreements and charted through Potsdam and Hamburg, remain open like thin arteries. The Western Allies decide to push those arteries to the limit and give the effort sober names. The Americans call it Operation Vittles, and the British call it Operation Plainfare. How do you script a timetable for the sky when fog, snow, and crosswinds mock the clock? On blackboards, a matrix of minutes, routes, altitudes, climb profiles, and landing slots takes shape. A sky express that soon moves with metronomic cadence and beats from the towers at Tempelhof and Gatow. The ground crews design a one-way taxi system, aircraft roll clockwise, unloading and refueling zones are fixed, no one stands still a second more than necessary. Each aircraft gets a standard profile for speed, climb rate, and radio calls, a template that multiplies redundancy and safety while shrinking human error. Who brings what, and how much does a metropolis need per day when bread, milk, coal, medicine, and spares are non-negotiable? The math is brutal. Berlin needs thousands of tons daily. At first, 3,000 to 4,500, later more than 8,000, and on a record day in April 1949, roughly 12,000 tons crossed the threshold. Coal dominates the manifests. Heavy, dirty, indispensable for electricity, heat, bakery ovens, and pumping stations that keep water moving. Flour, milk powder, yeast, salt, and medical goods follow, joined by machine oil, parts for waterworks, paper for schools and offices, and even small parcels and letters bound with twine. Which aircraft carried the burden, and why did some machines become legends? The American C-47, rugged and slow with a limited payload, opens the bridge, but the larger C-54 Skymaster takes over soon after with more lift, more range, and reliability in freezing nights and summer heat. The British add the Avro York and the Handley-Page Hastings, big freighters that tighten the rhythm and stage a precise ballet on the ramp at Gatow. Short Sunderland flying boats even land on the Havel, bringing salt that nibbles at metal but preserves food, then lift off from a lake turned into a runway. Where do you land when fields are scarce? And how do you build an airfield at record speed in a pressured city? The answer is Tegel, an improvised airport that rises from marshy ground in about 90 days, with the longest runway in Europe at the time, and the explosive removal of a radio mast that endangered the approach. Tempelhof remains the vast stomach. Its hangars gleam like cathedrals of pragmatism, and its ramps become belts that carry tons like grains of sand. Gatow completes the western arc, and together the fields form a triangle of precision that choreographs climb, descent, turn, and climb again in an unbroken loop. How tight was the spacing, really? And how do you keep your nerve in fog and rime ice? By autumn 1948, only seconds separate touchdowns, 1 aircraft per minute, and later even tighter stacks. Pilots fly on instruments and QDM bearings with altitude layers and radio markers ticking like a metronome. De-icing fluid, preheaters, and strict checklists curb risk. But winter still attacks on the roll and makes braking an art and takeoff an exam. When fog banks swallow Tempelhof, alternates stand ready, and the ramp masters reroute freight streams like chess moves in real time. Who turned chocolate into diplomacy, and why did his nickname become a symbol? An American pilot ties candy bars to tiny handkerchief parachutes and drops them just before Tempelhof for waiting children who wave back with their own handkerchiefs. And his gesture becomes a fairy tale whispered through a hard city. Children start calling the aircraft raisin bombers, and suddenly, logistics wears a smiling face while doing brutal work. The sweet rain weighs almost nothing but signals everything. It says that help is calories and comfort at once, and it binds metal formations to human warmth that shines through barbed wire. How do you pay for so many flights, so much fuel, so many hands and machines when the calendar burns and the budget sweats? By priorities and alliances, the Western powers spend political capital and money because the city is more than a place. It is a test of whether treaties and promises survive pressure. Every ton that lands is a statement about credibility, and every successful day raises the cost of retreat until retreat stops being an option. The airlift forges an early infrastructure of trust that later returns in alliances and standards, from shared radio procedures to coordinated weather services. Why was it not just a humanitarian action, but a strategic pivot that shaped the post-war order? Because the airlift shows that coercion by blockade can squeeze, but does not automatically redraw the map if the opponent turns logistics into counterpower and makes it visible to the world. Images of endless approach chains become news that teach everyone that 20th century supply is not only about rails, but also about controlled airspace. The lesson echoes across later crises, through air corridors to besieged cities, and into playbooks for synchronizing civil and military planning and scaling under catastrophe. What happened when the blockade ended in May 1949? And why did the engines keep turning anyway? On 12th May 1949, the barriers rise. Trains and trucks roll again. But the airlift does not slam to a halt. It runs on for months to build reserves that make the city harder to break. The runout is not showmanship. It is insurance against relapse and a ritual that lets the pilots close a clean rhythm instead of snapping it off. In the end, the numbers are heavy to grasp. Hundreds of thousands of flights, millions of kilometers, mountains of cargo. But more important is the feeling that precision and endurance speak a political language. Why does this matter now? When supply chains cross oceans, container ports are digital, and drones promise delivery at the tap. Because the airlift is still a masterclass in scaling under pressure, treating bottlenecks as a design brief, and building redundancy that cannot stop mistakes, but can blunt their consequences. In a world where critical infrastructure is brittle, Berlin 1948 proves that planning grows strong when it binds itself to empathy, because people follow plans better when they feel seen. The sweet rain of raisin bombers was not an aside. It was micro-design for morale that carried macro logistics, a principle that still applies to power grids, vaccine campaigns, and relief corridors. How do you hold morale when fatigue stacks layer on layer and the calendar shows no mercy? With rituals that structure tempo, clean handovers, real pauses, and a narrative of purpose that frames every task as a tile in a larger mosaic. The airlift is also a story of cooks in field kitchens, of mechanics with oil-black hands, of radio operators tapping letters into the night, and of children who learn to recognize aircraft by sound. When systems are stressed, these invisible roles breathe life into redundancy and translate whiteboard diagrams into action. Which errors occurred, and how were they turned into improvements instead of blame? Skids on icy taxiways became better grit plans. Radio confusion hardened into stricter phraseology. Long dwell times yielded modular unloading where cranes, people, and hand trucks mesh like gears. The learning curve steepened because every shift was treated as an experiment. Hypotheses tested, measurements logged, decisions documented with discipline. Resilience does not grow from wishful thinking but from data habits. And in that sense, the airlift is an early prototype of operations research in the field. How does a city change when the sky becomes its harbor? And what traces linger in streets and faces? Children grow up with new words: approach, corridor, slot. Berliners read wind the way others read the hour, And the neighborhoods around Tempelhof become shop windows to the world. Bakers adjust baking times when coal is scarce at dawn. Hospitals schedule procedures in step with freight lists that show oxygen bottles and medicine. From emergency comes a new habit of seeing daily life as an operations plan, and that perspective marks the city long after 1949. Who carries the story forward, and what is memory for when the last plane landed long ago? Museums, photographs, interviews, and the thin handkerchief parachutes some children kept become anchors for generations who would otherwise see only numbers. Memory is not nostalgia. It is training for crises that look different but run on similar logic, from the loss of a port to the shutdown of a digital corridor. If you understand the sky of 1948, you understand why redundancy is not luxury, but ethics, because it shields the vulnerable before they become statistics. In the end, there is a city that refuses to yield, pilots who turn tempo into history, and children who learn that help sometimes falls from the sky and tastes like cocoa. The airlift was logistics of the impossible, but more than that, it was a decision that people would not be collateral in geopolitical games, and that decision still demands new forms and the same courage. If a sky could become a lifeline for a city in 1948, why should it be so hard today to braid data, networks, and alliances into a new lifeline of our own? And if chocolate worked then, what small signs of humanity do our logistics need now so that precision does not feel cold, but builds trust? Because every blockade tells what power can do, but every airlift tells what power is for. Are we ready, in the next crisis, to be the runway where hope actually touches down?